Hauptmann Friedrich Weber pressed his forehead against the cold steel of the cupola rim, eyes fixed on the fuel gauge as though sheer willpower could conjure gasoline from nothing. The needle rested firmly on empty. It had been there for 4 days. Outside, the morning fog of September 19th, 1944, rolled across the Dutch countryside near Arnhem, thick enough to conceal his tank from British observation aircraft. Not that concealment mattered anymore. The Panther AUSF-G beneath him, 45 tons of sloped armour and precision engineering, armed with the magnificent 7.5 centimetre KWK-42 gun, might as well have been an ornamental fountain for all the tactical value it provided. 50 metres forward, Lieutenant Schroeder's Panther sat equally motionless, its crew smoking beside the road wheels. 50 metres behind, Feldwebel Kraus had abandoned his tank entirely, the men now sleeping in a nearby barn. 5 Panthers total, 5 of the most sophisticated armoured fighting vehicles ever produced by German industry. 5 useless monuments to immobility. Weber had received his first Panther in December of 1943, fresh from the factory at MAN in Nuremberg. He remembered walking around it with something approaching reverence. The sloped frontal armour, 80 mm thick at 55 degrees, could deflect American 75 mm rounds like rain off a slate roof. The long-barreled gun could penetrate a Sherman at 2,000 meters. The interleaved road wheel suspension delivered cross-country performance that made the older Panzer IVs feel like farm tractors. On paper, in technical specifications, measured by pure mechanical capability, the Panther was superior to anything the Western Allies fielded. He still believed that. But belief could not turn an engine over without fuel. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The radio crackled with static. Adler 2. This is Adler Lead. Fuel column status? Weber lifted the handset, thumb pressing the transmit button. Adler Lead, negative. No change. We were promised resupply at 0600 hours. Current time is 09:15. Acknowledged. Battalion reports delivery expected by 1300 hours. They had expected delivery yesterday as well, and the day before that. The promises had become a grim routine, like checking a broken watch and hoping time had somehow resumed. Weber descended from his immobilized fortress, boots squelching into mud that had been churned to soup by weeks of retreating German columns. His crew sat against the road wheels, the last cigarettes from their rations burning down to nothing. Gefreiter Hoffmann glanced up from cleaning his MP-40 submachine gun. Hauptmann? Are we moving today? Battalion says 1300 hours. Hoffmann nodded slowly, the kind of nod that communicated complete disbelief without requiring words. 23 years old, Hoffmann had crewed with Weber since the fighting in Normandy. He had learned to recognize empty promises. In the distance, the familiar drone of Allied aircraft engines approached. Weber did not bother looking skyward. If they were fighter bombers hunting for targets, his stationary tank presented an obvious silhouette even through the fog. If they were heavy bombers heading deeper into the Reich, they were someone else's catastrophe. Either way, without fuel to reposition, without fuel to withdraw to cover, he could do nothing but wait. This was not how the doctrine was supposed to function. Weber had entered the Wehrmacht in 1939, a young mechanical engineering graduate from the Technical University of Berlin. The Panzer Arm had seemed the natural choice for someone with his background, an organization that valued precision, technical excellence, systematic thinking. The entire philosophy of German armor warfare rested on a foundation of qualitative superiority, compensating for numerical inferiority. The instructors at the Panzer School in Wunsdorf had been explicit about this principle. Gentlemen, Oberst Dietrich had declared during a lecture in early 1940, you will face enemies with vast numerical advantages. The British Empire spans a quarter of the globe. The Soviet Union possesses inexhaustible manpower. And the Americans, he had smiled, a thin expression with no warmth. The Americans build automobiles and washing machines. They know manufacturing, perhaps, but they know nothing of military excellence. The solution to numerical inferiority, they taught, was engineering and tactical superiority. One German tank should equal 3 enemy tanks. One German soldier should outfight 5 enemy soldiers. It was mathematics rendered as doctrine. If German equipment was twice as capable, German training 3 times as thorough, German tactics twice as sophisticated, then numerical inferiority became manageable. Victory became achievable through excellence, and the equipment had seemed to validate the theory. Weber had commanded a Panzer IV during the French campaign in May of 1940, and the machine had performed beautifully reliable, powerful, more than sufficient against French tanks that possessed thick armour but poor coordination and inferior radios. Later, transferred to Army Group South in Russia during the autumn of 1941, he had witnessed Tigers tear through Soviet T-34 formations like harvesters through grain. The Tiger's 88mm gun could engage and destroy Soviet armour at ranges where return fire was impossible. When Weber received his first Panther in late 1943, he had walked a complete circuit around the vehicle with something close to awe. Every angle demonstrated thoughtful engineering. The sloped armour maximised protection without excessive weight. The gun could defeat any Allied tank in service. The Maybach HL 230 engine, despite its troublesome final drive, provided adequate mobility. The radio equipment allowed coordination. The optics were superb. German engineering at its absolute finest. But now, in September of 1944, surrounded by fog and mud and the terrible silence of immobile tanks, Weber was beginning to understand something the instructors at Wunsdorf had never addressed. Superior equipment required superior supply chains, and supply chains required fuel, and fuel required. The thought died as truck engines echoed from the eastern road. "Fuel column approaching!" Hoffman shouted, scrambling to his feet. The entire crew moved with sudden energy. Weber felt his pulse actually accelerate 4 days of waiting compressed into a spike of genuine hope. He jogged toward the road, watching 3 trucks materialize through the fog. Not fuel trucks. Opel Blitz cargo trucks with canvas covers, hauling ammunition? Rations? Replacement personnel? The lead truck decelerated as it approached Weber's position. He raised his hand, flagging it down. A harried-looking Obergefreiter leaned from the cab window, face streaked with road grime. "Hauptmann, I cannot stop long. We are running supplies forward to— Where is the fuel column? We were promised resupply 4 days ago." The driver's expression communicated the answer before words formed. "Hauptmann, there is no fuel column. The depot at Arnhem is completely dry. We are operating on emergency reserves. I have perhaps 30 kilometers remaining in my tank, maybe less." 30 kilometers? How do you intend to return to base? "I do not. We will deliver these supplies, abandon the vehicles, and walk back." The driver glanced at Weber's Panther, appreciation and pity mixing in his eyes. "A magnificent machine, Hauptmann. A shame about the circumstances." The truck lurched forward before Weber could formulate a response, disappearing, back into the fog like an apparition. He stood in the rutted road, watching it vanish, feeling something cold and heavy settle behind his ribs. No fuel column. The depot was dry. The trucks themselves were being abandoned after one final delivery. Weber walked back to his crew, who waited with expectant faces turned toward him. He shook his head once. No one asked for elaboration. For the next 2 hours, they sat in silence, while 8 kilometers distant, the battle for Arnhem Bridge raged. British paratroopers from the 1st Airborne Division were fighting desperately to hold their positions against SS and SS Panzer Corps counterattacks. German infantry were being fed into brutal close-quarters combat, and Weber's 5 Panthers machines that could have decisively influenced the tactical situation sat motionless, monuments to Germany's collapsing logistics. Then the American fighter bombers arrived. The P-47 Thunderbolts came in low, screaming out of the overcast sky with a sound, like tearing canvas. Weber barely had time to shout, "Aircraft, take cover!" before the first rocket struck. Schroeder's Panther, 50 meters forward, erupted in orange flame. The rocket had penetrated the thin engine deck armor and ignited the residual fuel vapors in the tank. Secondary explosions followed as ammunition cooked off, each detonation sending the turret ring several centimeters higher until the entire fighting compartment was engulfed. Weber threw himself into the drainage ditch, running parallel to the road, hands over his helmet as the thunderbolts made their second pass. Hoffman landed beside him with a grunt. The earth transmitted shock waves through Weber's chest. Explosions felt as much as heard. One rocket struck his own Panther, not penetrating the frontal armor but obliterating the right track assembly. Another hit Krause's tank, killing the engine with a shriek of tortured metal and ruptured components. The aircraft departed as quickly as they had arrived, leaving behind burning vehicles and ringing silence. Weber lifted his head cautiously. Schroeder's Panther blazed like a cremation pyre, black smoke boiling into the fog. His own tank sat crippled, the right track blown completely off the road wheels and draped across the ground like a dead snake. Krause's Panther leaked oil from multiple ruptures, the engine block clearly fractured. 5 tanks 4 days ago, 3 now destroyed or permanently disabled, 2 untouched but equally useless without fuel. And the Americans could fly whenever weather permitted, strike whatever targets intelligence identified, because they possessed fuel for their aircraft. They possessed fuel for their trucks. They possessed fuel for everything. Weber found himself laughing, a bitter sound containing no humor whatsoever. "We build the best tanks in the world," he said to no one in particular, "and we park them like practice targets for anyone with bombs." That afternoon, Wehrmacht engineers arrived not with fuel, but with demolition charges. A young lieutenant with a clipboard explained the situation with bureaucratic efficiency. "We are establishing a new defensive line 12 kilometers east. Cannot leave intact vehicles for British recovery. You will destroy what cannot be moved." Weber placed the charges himself, hands moving through familiar procedures while his mind operated separately. 45 tons of precision engineering, thousands of hours of factory labor, irreplaceable resources of steel, aluminum, rubber, reduced to scrap metal to prevent enemy capture, not destroyed in glorious combat against overwhelming odds. Simply abandoned because Germany could not deliver gasoline. The Panther's armor would survive the explosion mostly intact, he knew. British recovery teams would find it, study the construction, marvel at the engineering sophistication, and they would understand, with perfect clarity, that Germany had lost the war not through inferior design but through logistics collapse. The charges detonated at 1700 hours, blowing the engine and transmission into unusable fragments. Weber and his crew joined a column of infantry retreating eastward, leaving behind 3 burning Panthers and 2 demolition craters where technological superiority had stood. Weber's war continued for 3 more months, though continued was perhaps too generous. He received a replacement Panther in late November, a factory rebuild with fresh paint barely concealing repaired battle damage. The tank ran. In late 1944, that alone seemed miraculous. By December, he found himself assigned to Panzer Lehr Division's remnants, reorganized and re-equipped for Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Ardennes offensive. The Americans would call it the Battle of the Bulge. Weber would remember it as the final, complete education in why Germany was losing. The operational planning for Wacht am Rhein had hinged entirely on captured supplies. The Panzer divisions would break through thinly held American positions, overrun forward supply depots, refuel from captured American gasoline stocks, and drive northwest to Antwerp. The plan was audacious. The plan was desperate. The plan required, Weber realized within 12 hours of the offensive's start, that American soldiers simply abandon their supplies without fighting. They did not. Weber's Kampfgruppe advanced approximately 40 kilometers in the first 2 days, pushing through American positions near Bastogne. Then the fuel ran out. Not from combat attrition, not from mechanical failure. The tanks simply consumed their allotted fuel, and no resupply column arrived. His Panther coasted to a stop on a forest road east of Bastogne on December 18, 1944. the Maybach engine coughing its last rotation as the fuel pump drew air instead of gasoline. Behind him, the entire column had stalled like a parade frozen in place. Ahead, he could hear American vehicles, distinctive roar of truck engines, the grinding of tank treads, the general mechanical chaos of a functioning military force. The Americans were moving. The Germans were stationary. When the Sherman appeared around the bend 30 minutes later, Weber did not attempt resistance. His gun had no hydraulic traverse mechanism. The fluid had been scavenged weeks earlier for another vehicle. His machine guns had no ammunition. It had been redistributed to infantry 2 days prior. His crew had no energy. They had spent the previous day pushing the Panther with logs under the tracks, attempting to roll it into a defensive position. An American lieutenant approached cautiously. M1 carbine raised to shoulder level. Weber raised both hands. Ich ergebe mich, he said clearly. I surrender. The American lowered his weapon slightly, examining the Panther with professional interest. Out of gas. Weber nodded. The lieutenant laughed, not cruel, simply amazed. Jesus Christ. We've been scared of these things for 6 months. And you guys ran out of gas? They loaded Weber and his crew into a truck, a GMC CC, KW 6x6, the Americans called it, though the soldiers simply said, Jimmy or deuce and a half. The truck's fuel gauge read 3/4 full. The driver mentioned casually that they would refuel at the next depot, approximately 30 kilometers rearward. 30 kilometers. The Americans maintained fuel depots every 30 kilometers. Weber said nothing during the ride, but his mind was working through calculations. 30 kilometers between depots, 3/4 tank remaining after forward operations. Casual refueling mentioned as routine procedure. The mathematics of it, the sheer tonnage required to maintain that density of supply, exceeded anything he had conceptualized. The prisoner of war compound was established 40 kilometers behind the front lines, near Liège in Belgium. Weber arrived expecting barbed wire and guard towers. These were present, certainly, but what shocked him was everything surrounding the camp. The camp sat adjacent to a major supply route, and for the first week of his captivity, Weber did nothing but watch trucks. American trucks. Endless American trucks. They moved day and night without cessation. GMC Jimmies. Studebaker US 6S. Dodge WC series. They came loaded with ammunition crates, food rations, fuel jerrycans, medical supplies, replacement parts, mail bags, blankets, boots, everything required to sustain military operations. They departed empty and returned full. The cycle never stopped. Not for weather, not for darkness, not for anything. Weber began counting on January 3rd, 1945. Standing at the wire fence, he counted trucks for exactly 12 hours, from 0600 to 1800 hours. He counted 2,417 vehicles passing in one direction on one road in half a day. A British prisoner of war, captured during Operation Market Garden at Arnhem, joined Weber at the fence on the 3rd day. Flight Lieutenant David Thornton had been shot down in a Hawker typhoon and spent 2 months in German captivity before being liberated when American forces overran his camp. Impressive, isn't it? Thornton said, nodding toward the endless convoy. Where does it all come from? Weber asked. Antwerp, mostly. The Americans opened the port in late November. Before that, everything came through Normandy beaches or Cherbourg. Thornton lit a cigarette, American tobacco, Weber noted. Do you know what the daily tonnage requirement is for the Allied armies in Europe? Weber shook his head. Approximately 40,000 tons, every single day. Fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, spare parts, mail, everything. 40,000 tons daily. Thornton exhaled smoke. And they're delivering it. Not perfectly, mind you. There was a crisis in September when the logistics couldn't keep pace with the advance, but they solved it. Built new depots, laid new pipelines, brought in more trucks. 40,000 tons daily. Weber tried to conceptualize the number. A single Panther division required approximately 400 tons of supplies per day during active operations, and that was considered logistically intensive. 40,000 tons meant the Americans were supplying the equivalent of 100 Panzer divisions simultaneously. "How many trucks do they have?" Weber heard himself ask. Thornton laughed. "Hundreds of thousands. Maybe more. I saw a report before I was shot down, estimating the Americans had produced over 800,000 trucks by mid-1944. Not for civilian use. For military operations only. 800,000 trucks. Germany's entire truck production, for all purposes, military and civilian combined, had reached perhaps 300,000 vehicles since 1939. The Americans had built nearly 3 times that number for military use, alone in 5 years. Weber watched another convoy pass, GMC Jimmies, each carrying 2.5 tons of cargo. 30 trucks in this particular convoy meant 75 tons of supplies. He had counted 87 convoys yesterday. If each convoy averaged 30 trucks, the mathematics was staggering. Thornton said, interrupting Weber's calculations. "Magnificent machine, truly. Our intelligence reports said it was nearly invincible from the front. Is that accurate?" "Yes," Weber said. "At combat ranges, the Sherman's 75mm gun cannot penetrate the frontal armor. The Panther can destroy a Sherman at 2,000 meters. The Sherman needs to close to under 500 meters for a chance at a kill, and even then only with a perfect shot at weak points. So tactically superior in every way." "Tactically. Yes, absolutely. But you still lost." Weber said nothing. The trucks continued passing. Over the following weeks, Weber began conversations with other prisoners, German soldiers from various units, various branches. A Luftwaffe pilot named Hartmann had flown an Me-262 jet fighter, the most advanced aircraft in the world, capable of speeds exceeding 870 kilometers per hour. "We shot down bombers easily," Hartmann explained. "The American B-17 seconds could not evade us, but we spent more time on the ground waiting for fuel than flying missions. The jets consumed fuel at enormous rates, and the refineries could not produce enough." An infantry Obergefreiter named Klaus had fought at Monte Cassino in Italy. "The Americans shelled our positions for hours," he said, still sounding stunned months later. "Not minutes, hours, continuous artillery fire. We estimated they fired more shells in one day than our entire division's monthly allotment. When they finally attacked, we had no ammunition left to resist. We had fired everything we possessed. They had barely begun consuming their stockpiles." A submarine officer, Kapitan Lieutenant Fischer, had commanded a Type XXI U-boat, the most advanced submarine design of the war, capable of sustained underwater speeds that made it nearly uncatchable. "We completed 2 patrols," Fischer said. "Both times we returned early. Not from damage, not from Allied attacks. We could not find fuel to continue operations. The boat performed beautifully, but it sat in port because the refineries prioritized the Luftwaffe and the Panzer divisions." Every conversation followed the same pattern. German equipment that was superior in design, superior in performance, rendered useless by logistics failure. Weber requested paper and pencil from the American guards. They provided both without questions. He began making calculations, working through the mathematics of industrial warfare. Germany had produced approximately 6,000 Panther tanks between January 1943 and April 1945. The United States had produced approximately 49,000 Sherman tanks in the same period. But the disparity in production was not the critical factor, Weber realized. The critical factor was deployment. Of the 6,000 Panthers produced, perhaps 4,000 reached frontline units. Of those 4,000, combat losses claimed approximately 60%, but mechanical breakdowns and lack of spare parts disabled another 25%. And fuel shortages immobilized the remainder at critical moments. The result: at any given time during 1944, Germany could field perhaps 500 operational Panthers across all fronts. The Americans, by contrast, could field tens of thousands of operational Shermans simultaneously because they possessed the logistics infrastructure to keep them supplied, fueled, and maintained. Superior design meant nothing without superior supply. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. In March of 1945, the American Guards organized work details for prisoners. Weber volunteered, simply to escape the monotony of camp routine. They assigned him to a supply depot 10 kilometers from the compound, unloading trucks and organizing material. The depot covered approximately 2 square kilometers. Weber had never seen anything comparable in the Wehrmacht. Warehouses held ammunition sorted by caliber. Separate warehouses held rations, not the thin soups and hard bread of German field kitchens, but canned meat, powdered eggs, chocolate, coffee, cigarettes. Another warehouse held nothing but medical supplies. Another held spare parts for vehicles, organized by truck model and component type. An American supply sergeant named Jackson supervised Weber's detail. Jackson was 42 years old, too old for infantry service but perfectly suited for logistics work. He had managed a warehouse in Detroit before the war. "How much does this depot hold?" Weber asked one afternoon. Jackson consulted a clipboard. "Currently, about 8,000 tons, but that fluctuates. We receive deliveries daily, distribute daily. Average turnover time is about 4 days. Supplies arrive, get sorted, get shipped forward, space gets refilled." 8,000 tons, Weber repeated. "And this is one depot?" "One of maybe 50 between here and the coast. Bigger ones closer to Antwerp handle 15, 20,000 tons. Jackson noticed Weber's expression. "You're German armor, right?" "Panzers?" "Yes." "Panther tanks?" "Yeah, I've seen a few of those. Beautiful machines. Heard they were hell on wheels in a fight." Jackson paused, choosing words carefully. "Can I ask you something? Why didn't you guys build more trucks instead of more tanks?" The question hit Weber like a physical blow because he had no answer. Or rather, he had the answer but had never articulated it clearly until this moment. "We believed," Weber said slowly, "that superior equipment would compensate for inferior numbers. We believed that one excellent tank was worth 3 adequate tanks. We believed that tactical excellence would defeat strategic material advantage. And we were wrong." Jackson nodded. Yeah, I think you were." That evening, Weber sat in the barracks and wrote out the calculation that had been forming in his mind for weeks. Germany's fundamental strategic error was not technical. German engineers had produced excellent designs. The Panther was superior to the Sherman in armor, firepower, and arguably mobility. The Tiger was even more formidable. The Me-262 jet fighter exceeded Allied aircraft performance dramatically. Type XXI submarines were revolutionary. The error was conceptual. Germany had approached industrial warfare as though it were still 1914, when a smaller but better trained and better equipped army could achieve decisive victories through superior tactics and morale. But industrial warfare in the 1940s had changed. It was no longer about the quality of individual weapon systems. It was about the quantity of deployed, supplied, functioning weapon systems maintained at the front over sustained periods. The Americans understood this intuitively. They built adequate equipment, not the best, not the most sophisticated, but adequate, and then they built it in staggering quantities. More importantly, they built the trucks to move it, the depots to store it, the pipelines to pump it, the ships to transport it, the ports to unload it, the roads to carry it, and the organization to manage it all. A Sherman tank was inferior to a Panther in nearly every measurable combat characteristic. But 5 Shermans with full fuel tanks, adequate ammunition, spare parts available, and air support overhead would defeat one Panther with a quarter tank of fuel, limited ammunition, no replacement parts, and no air cover, every single time. Germany had built beautiful machines and starved them. America had built adequate machines and fed them endlessly. The war ended in May of 1945. Weber remained in American custody until September, when repatriation procedures finally processed him back to Germany. He returned to a country that no longer existed as he had known it, divided, occupied, demolished, reduced to rubble and starvation. He found work eventually, his engineering degree still valuable despite everything, a position at a manufacturing firm in Stuttgart, producing agricultural machinery. The owner, Herr Dietrich, had served in the Kriegsmarine during the war. They never discussed specific experiences, but they understood each other. One afternoon in late 1946, Dietrich asked Weber to review production schedules. "We need to increase output," Dietrich explained. "The farmers need more tractors than we can currently deliver. What would you recommend?" Weber looked at the numbers. The factory was running at capacity. The machinery was adequate. The workforce was skilled, but the supply chain was fragmented. Components arrived irregularly. Production paused, waiting for parts. Finished tractors sat in warehouses waiting for fuel to deliver them. "We don't need better tractors," Weber said. "We need better logistics. We need guaranteed component deliveries. We need fuel allocation for transportation. We need organized distribution to customers. We need the entire system functioning together, not just the manufacturing." Dietrich smiled, a sad expression. "You learned that in the war." "Yes," Weber said. "I learned it watching American trucks." Years later, decades later, Weber would read historical analyses of World War II. Historians debated strategy, leadership, decisive battles, turning points. They discussed Stalingrad and Kursk and Normandy. They analyzed Hitler's errors, Churchill's determination, Roosevelt's industrial mobilization, Stalin's ruthlessness. But Weber always returned to the same: memory. Standing at a fence in a prisoner of war camp in January of 1945, counting trucks, 2,417 trucks in 12 hours on one road, not carrying soldiers, not carrying tanks, just carrying supplies, fuel and food and ammunition and boots and mail and chocolate and coffee and everything else required to keep armies functioning. The Americans had not won because they built better tanks. They had won because they built more trucks. In 1982, Weber's grandson, young Friedrich, named after his grandfather, asked about the war during a family dinner. The boy was 14, studying World War II in school, fascinated by tales of Tiger tanks and Spitfires and aircraft carriers. "Opa?" the boy asked, using the familiar German term for grandfather. "You commanded a Panther tank, right? The teachers say the Panther was better than American tanks. Why did Germany lose if we had better equipment?" Weber set down his fork carefully. He was 70 years old now, his hair white, his hands affected by mild arthritis, but his mind remained sharp, the memories undimmed. "We had better tanks," Weber said quietly. "That is true. The Panther could destroy a Sherman at ranges where the Sherman could not fight back. In a one-on-one engagement, the Panther won almost every time. So why won? Because wars are not won by one-on-one engagements, Friedrich. Wars are won by logistics, by fuel and ammunition and food and spare parts arriving exactly when and where they are needed, by trucks running day and night without stopping, by depots that never run empty, by pipelines and ports and roads and organization." Weber paused, gathering his thoughts. "I once commanded 5 Panther tanks, beautiful machines, sophisticated, powerful, and all 5 sat motionless for 4 days because we had no fuel. Then, American aircraft destroyed 3 of them while they could not move. We demolished the other 2 ourselves to prevent capture. Not one of them fired a shot in combat. Not one. They were perfect machines rendered useless because Germany could not deliver gasoline." The boy looked confused. "But if we knew we needed fuel, we knew. Of course we knew. But knowing and doing are different things. Germany's entire industrial production could not match America's logistics capacity. We built 6,000 Panthers in 2 years. The Americans built 49,000 Shermans. But more importantly, the Americans built 800,000 trucks to supply those Shermans. Germany built perhaps 100,000 trucks for all purposes in 6 years. Weber leaned back in his chair. I spent months in an American prisoner of war camp. I watched their supply convoys. I worked in their depots. I saw how they organized material, and I understood, finally, why we lost. Not because their tanks were better, they were not. Not because their soldiers were braver, they were not. We lost because they understood something. We did not. That modern warfare is won in factories and warehouses and on supply roads long before it is decided on battlefields. So, equipment doesn't matter? Equipment matters. Of course it matters. But supply matters more. A mediocre tank with fuel, ammunition, and spare parts will defeat an excellent tank with an empty fuel gauge. Every time. Without exception. The boy nodded slowly, processing this. Remember this, Friedrich, Weber said. In war, as in life, excellence means nothing without support. The best tool in the world is useless if you cannot power it, maintain it, supply it. Germany built excellent tools and starved them. America built adequate tools and fed them endlessly. That is why they won. Weber died in 1991, 6 months after the Berlin Wall fell and 2 years after German reunification began. His funeral was small family, a few old colleagues, some neighbors. The pastor spoke briefly about Weber's life, his education, his service, his post-war career, his family. But Weber's grandson, now a successful logistics manager for an international shipping company, added an unscheduled eulogy. He told the story his grandfather had told him years before, about 5 Panther tanks sitting silent for lack of fuel, about 2,417 American trucks passing a prisoner of war camp in half a day, about the hard lesson that excellence without supply is just expensive decoration. My grandfather learned something in the war that shaped the rest of his life, Friedrich said to the assembled mourners. He learned that the foundation of success in war, in industry, in any endeavor, is not brilliance but reliability, not sophistication but consistency, not the best tools but the best systems. He carried that lesson into everything he did after the war. He built those systems, he valued them, he understood their importance. Friedrich paused, looking at the simple coffin. He used to say that Germany lost the war the moment we decided to build 6,000 perfect tanks instead of 60,000 adequate trucks. I think about that often in my work. The most sophisticated system in the world fails if the supply chain breaks. The best product fails if it cannot reach customers. Excellence fails without logistics. The funeral ended. The mourners departed. Friedrich Weber was buried in a cemetery in Stuttgart, not far from the factory where he had worked for 40 years. His grave marked with a simple stone bearing his name and dates. But the lesson remained. In military academies, logistics officers still teach the Panther's paradox, how Germany produced some of the finest armored vehicles in history and lost the war because they could not keep them fueled. In business schools, supply chain courses reference Operation Wacht am Rhein as a case study in catastrophic logistics failure. In engineering programs, students learn that optimal design must account for supply chain realities. The Panther tank entered history as a monument to excellence defeated by logistics. Museum examples sit preserved worldwide mechanical marvels that visitors photograph and admire. And next to them, usually, sit preserved GMC Jimmy trucks and Studebaker US 6S, the unglamorous workhorses that actually won the war. The Americans did not win World War II because they built better tanks. They won because they built more trucks. They won because they understood that fuel delivered matters more than armor thickness. They won because they grasped the fundamental truth of industrial warfare, that quantity of supply defeats quality of equipment when supply lines function and fuel gauges stay full. Friedrich Weber sat in his Panther for 4 days, watching the fuel gauge rest on empty, waiting for a resupply column that never came. In those 4 days, American trucks delivered thousands of tons of supplies to Allied forces across Europe, without pause, without failure, without stopping. That was the war, not the tactical engagements shown in films, not the dramatic battles analysed in histories. The real war, the decisive war, was fought on supply roads by trucks running day and night, by depots that never emptied, by pipelines that pumped fuel forward without cease, by organisational systems that treated logistics as the foundation of victory rather than the support for it. Germany built the best tanks in the world and parked them like monuments when the fuel ran out. America built adequate tanks and kept them running with rivers of gasoline. The Panthers sat silent. The Shermans kept moving. And that simple difference, that unglamorous, undramatic difference, decided the war. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.